Guy Claxton, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me and for sharing your thoughts with the wider Rethinking Education Conference.
It's my pleasure. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's a pleasure to be able to record a few thoughts together with you, James.
Indeed. Well, we're in person now, at least,
Yes.
but not in person with everybody else. But maybe next time. This may well be the first of many. So your talk has a revised title. Your talk is now called The Archaeology of Education, an Institution Built on Sand. Why the title?
Question mark.
Question mark. Thank you. That's an important.
Is it an institution built on sand?
Okay, so what's your thinking behind this title? Where do you want to take this conversation?
Well, I've been thinking recently about reflecting back on my own work and realizing that I've started my building learning power approach work is very much around what is it possible for teachers to do in pretty conventional schools. But I've been aware for a long time, that it's like that we can come at education or educational thinking or critique or reform at a lot of different levels. And I think learning power approach has been a relatively kind of unradical. It's like, what steps could teachers take in the direction of an education vision? So it's like, I think, we need ideas and we need experiments at a whole lot of different levels. We need the kind of gradual, what's the next step type level, but we also need things that are bolder and bigger. We need, in some schools, in experiments that I've been involved with, Atelier 21, Charlotte Church's The Arwen Project, range of different things around. So it's like we needed things across this whole range. But I think that even the things that are relatively doable, let's say, the less radical ones, really need to be based on a strong critique and a strong vision. They need coherence. There needs to be a sense of what are we tinkering our way towards, as well as what are we reacting to, or what are we moving away from. So I've been thinking more about, trying to unpack those different levels and see them as sort of making different contributions, if you like, to the deep thinking about education, the practice and the purpose that most people I know think is really necessary. It's vital at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking about this recently, about how it seems that we're at a point in history, or in time, if you like, where we're becoming more self-aware. I think people are starting to critique. I never used to critique when I was a kid. I never used to critique a lesson. I never left a lesson thinking that was a good lesson or that was a bad lesson. I just thought that was a lesson. But young people seem much more self-aware, much more critical consumers, if you like, of education. And I think as a profession, and the people who sit around education beyond the teaching profession, it seems that we're becoming more self-aware and we're starting to ask these big questions. And I think that implicit in what you just said is that what we have has sort of been cobbled together over the ages, and it hasn't really been a coherent vision, and it hasn't had a clear idea of what it is that it's trying to achieve. It's just sort of evolved a little bit like school buildings have evolved.
Well,
they were often
exactly.
built many years ago and then have weird little bits added on. It feels like the education system itself.
It's sort of philosophically and psychologically a bit of that kind of lash up, a bit of a mixture. You look at a lot of schools today, not all, but a lot of schools, and you can see like what goes on in the school is a kind of mixture of precedent and strong characters and strong historical characters and reacting to external pressures, and you get sort of a kind of workable but synthesis, or it's not even a real synthesis, but like a mixture of those kinds of things which dictate everyday practice. And my dream, if I have a dream, it's sort of to start from like everything in the school should be traceable back to a sense of core purpose or core vision behind what we're doing in the school. And as I say, I think these, when we think about educational reform, it's really important to be tinkering towards. It's like I'm always reminded of John Lennon's famous line, "How can I go forwards if I don't know which way I'm facing?" Otherwise, as I say, I think everything is just firefighting.
Yeah, I agree, and it's definitely not a synthesis. I mean, you wouldn't call it a synthesis. It seems like more like a soup, like a heady broth
Yeah,
of all these strange ingredients that don't quite work together.
sure. Well, a dog's breakfast would be putting it a bit strongly, but there's a whiff of the dog's breakfast about a lot of schools, and that no one's to blame for that. It's like everybody is making the best of what there is, but I think we are at a point where we need to be digging as deep as we can into questioning things, maybe things that we've taken for granted about the way schools are and the way they run. I think, just in order to make real progress and to develop this coherence, we need to dig down and say, how come? It'd be almost like sort of a Martian lands and looks at school and says, really? You do that? Why do you do that? That's peculiar. So it's like that's where my thinking has been for the last little while.
Yeah, and this idea of purpose is something that lots of people are starting to cohere around. Recently, there was the Times Education Commission,
Yep.
and their first point, as I recall from their 10-point plan, was we need a clear vision, a clear purpose around what education is. And in Mick Waters and Tim Brighouse's recent book about our schools, they made very much the same point. And there are a number of parallels between the Times Commission's recommendations and what Mick and Tim came up with through their sort of inquiry that they've done in recent years. And so everybody seems to be saying we need a clear purpose of education, or purposes.
Yeah,
I think that it's a plural.
Yes, that's possible.
It's a plural thing.
Yeah.
But we don't seem to have gotten quite as far as figuring out what that might be. How we could have a purpose. I mean, it just seems to me that there are purposes, and therefore that it's never going to be resolved, this question. And to my mind, therefore, we need a more diverse system that's more responsive. But I don't want to put even though I'm already doing it, I don't want to put my thoughts into your mind.
Yeah.
So I know that you've worked up a sort of like a it's a thesis, putting it a bit strongly, but you've got some ideas that you'd like to share. And so I wonder if you'd be happy to sort of to talk for a bit, and I'll interject when I see fit.
Sure.
So that you can just to give us a sense of the flow of the ideas that you've been thinking about.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James. So I'm sort of coming back to this. It's like it is coming back to this sort of deeper questioning of why do we do it that way? Why do we do education that way? I'm thinking back to when I first got involved in education. I was getting towards the end of doing my DPhil in experimental psychology at Oxford. And I joined a kind of educational think tank group. This was in about 1972, 73. And the world was awash with radical thinking about education. Penguin were publishing a series of books, Illich's Deschooling Society, books with titles like School is Dead, Everett Reimer, Death at an Early Age, Jonathan Kozol, The Underachieving School, John Holt. And there was a real sense of a kind of deep questioning, not necessarily challenging, but deep questioning about why we do things the way we do them. Why do we have exit exams at school? Why not leave it up to universities and employers to determine whether someone is qualified to take advantage of opportunities? Why do we have norm-referenced exams, which require that approximately a third of youngsters, whatever the overall level of performance, a third of them are going to come out of school with designated failures, relative failures? Is that necessary? Why do we do that? Why do exams require losers? Why do we have subjects? Why do things have to be chopped up? The world isn't carved in that kind of way, but we carve it in that way at school. But I wonder whether we're carving famous expression in cognitive science, whether we're carving nature at its joints, or whether we're just hacking it to bits in some way or other.
Interesting.
Why the unquestioned textbook? I would love to see, and it's perfectly possible, students in a class interrogating the textbook. What's the political position? What can we infer from the way that it's written? What is being taken for granted? What's not being recorded in this history text? And so on. I mean, you could convene a critical historical literacy curriculum around the interrogation of a textbook. You can, but most schools don't. They're not treated that way. Why classes of 20 or 30 youngsters? Why age cohorts? When we know that in any group of 13-year-olds, some of them are intellectually 15 or 16 and some of them are 9 or 10. So why do we insist on putting them together in that way? So there's a whole list of things. Why timetables? Why homework? Why breaks? Why lessons of 45 or 50 minutes? Like, in whose interests is that? Is the question. I've been thinking about, like, cui bono is the kind of the legal thing. It's like, who benefits from schools being done this way?
Yeah.
And out of this thinking comes the realization for me that often what's sacrificed, what schools don't seem to be designed for, is the optimization of learning and inquiry. That seems to be something that may be being sacrificed or squashed or constrained by all these habits that we have in school. Now, there may be other good reasons. This isn't an argument against knowledge. Some people might think that I'm making that argument. Absolutely not. But why, we can turn that question around on knowledge and say, why the Tudors rather than China or Ukraine? Why trigonometry rather than all kinds of interesting issues to do with probability, although I know probability is taught in school these days.
Can I just ask you about something that you mentioned there? You just said that schools are not optimized for learning. And I imagine that some people might find that quite jarring because they might think, well, schools are all about learning. Can you explain what you mean by that? You said they're not optimized for learning and inquiry, and they seem to be separate things, but can you just focus on the learning bit? What do you mean by that?
Sure. Well, I'll start from, for example, Stash DeHane's recent book called The Science of Learning, in which he makes it abundantly clear from a wealth of research that we are designed from the brain upwards to be stimulated to inquire into things that are unexpected or curious. That's like our fundamental nature as learners is for learning to be stimulated and directed by that which is unexpected, strange, or inquiring. Yet many schools don't start from curiosity. We are built, our learning is driven. Curiosity is the engine of learning. We know that now. And yet, curiously, a lot of teachers feel that they don't have the time, even at the beginning of a new module of work, to get youngsters curious about it. Even just to start with, what do you know? What are you not sure about? What would you like to know about this topic is something that often gets neglected in schools. So as a scientist, I take a very broad sense of what learning is. Learning is distilling competence out of experience, if you like. Learning is what we do in order to build our real world competence.
Right.
And that's the way we're designed. That's what embodied cognition, the science of embodied cognition, which I'm working in. That's what we're told. And yet you look at what goes on in school, you look at the modus operandi of school, and sometimes you can be rather puzzled about, what is this? People sort of talk down about relevance. It's like, why should we make things relevant? Well, for goodness sake, we're asking youngsters to invest 12 important years of their early lives. If there isn't a strong argument which says, and out of this comes real world competence, then I think, that's a challenge that you have to rise to. So a broad definition of learning rather than learning being simply restricted to the comprehension and recapitulation of relatively cut and dried knowledge.
Yeah, I see. Okay. And it seems like you're talking about learning that's driven by the individual rather than learning that is driven by the teacher and by the curriculum and by the government and by Ofsted, which is what we've got. We've got this very top down.
Yeah.
The impetus comes from the top down. And so you're talking about the fundamental nature of learning should be something that is driven by curiosity and exploration from the individual.
It is. That is the fundamental nature of learning. So it's kind of odd, I'm just kind of being my Martian, looking at school and saying, it's odd that a lot of what goes on in school doesn't capitalize or doesn't connect with that fundamental motive force behind learning. Isn't that strange?
Yeah, I see. Thank you. And it's interesting to hear you harking back to the radical tradition that you were just mentioning, people like Postman and Weingartner and Illich and John Holt and all the rest of them. That was really the impetus for me starting the podcast, which is what led to this conference coming about, the sort of the momentum that grew out of that podcast. Because that radical tradition seems to have disappeared. I don't see books with titles like that anymore. And I don't think that those questions have been settled. So certainly, to my mind, they haven't been settled. But it feels like lots of the discourse around education has become around efficiency. And it's about like, what's the most efficient way to use this time? How can we get the grades to go ever higher? Is it if we become more coercive? Is it if we become super, super strict about sock colour and top buttons being done up? Is that the way that we can work this machine even more efficiently to get even more top grades out of these kids? And it's just more and more top-down stuff. And you could argue that that's the point of education, but for me, I don't think that answers the question satisfactorily. Sure. And you can see that there are so many young people and adults, teachers among them, who are really suffering because of the way in which the system is currently configured. And that word configured is a bit loaded, isn't it? Because it suggests a designer, and it's not really. It hasn't really designed. It's sort of that is weird evolution, like we're going back to the heady brew that everything's sort of been cobbled together in this quite ad hoc way.
Yeah, I don't think there's any kind of malign force behind education being the sort of dog's breakfast that it is, but there are clearly, it's like, one of the questions that my Martian asks is who benefits from school being the way it is, and clearly there are a number of quite pragmatic answers to that. There's parents benefit where both parents are working. Someone has to take care of their kids all day. This is a point that Illich made, 40, 50 years ago. You could argue that maybe not consciously, but unconsciously, one of the purposes of school, because school is very sort of, it seems to me, largely built around a kind of middle-class discourse, middle-class values. You can imagine a traditional sort of, dining table with us discussing, children being inducted into having discussions about, social matters of interest or whatever it might be, and not, and school therefore being in a way set up. This has been a big problem with school. That the nature of school maps more directly onto the nature of middle-class discourse and middle-class interest than it does onto, and not just class, but also ethnic, cultural ways of doing learning and ways of doing socializing. So, there's an issue there. Teachers benefit because it gives them, teacher workforce, it gives them employment with long holidays. It's convenience of administration is going to be another driving force. And obviously financial vested interests, the software developers, the exam boards, the book publishers, and so on. So there are all kinds of vested interests in school being the way it is. But as I said, I think, given those, and some of them are legitimate, some of them have their place at the table, but the kind of preparation for a life of learning, harnessing your curiosity, refining it, developing it, building power and capacity for judicious adventurousness in your in your thinking, for critical thinking, all the things that OECD and others are talking about at the moment, that seems to have been squashed down, to be pushed down the agenda a bit. And I think we need to be asking these deeper questions to see whether we can reconfigure things, rejig things, so that preparation for a learning life, for living in a complex, demanding, challenging, stressful, engaging, opportunistic life, whether we are doing everything we can in schools to prepare young people for that. And I don't know anybody who'd argue against that. The question is, are we doing everything we could?
Yes, yeah, I see. And I mean, it depends on who you are and where you stand as to how you answer that question, doesn't it? And that's partly why I argue for a more diverse system, because we need to cater to all interests. And at the moment, there are people who are really passionate about the traditional hierarchy of subjects from English and maths and sciences and humanities on down to the what are considered to be the less.
Down,
Yes, indeed,
right.
yeah, what are considered to be the less important subjects, the less
Yeah,
academic subjects. And you make the point, don't you, that these are often the subjects that are more bodily and less flighty, less sort of
yeah,
intellectual subjects
yeah.
are considered to be less worthy.
Yes, I think part of the, I mean, we've had a look at the kind of cui bono question, but I think, for me, the next question is, are there unchallenged, maybe even unaware assumptions about the way we think about learning, knowledge, what it is to know, understanding, the nature of the mind, if you like, which were current at the point of the foundation of school. But we know from an awful lot of science and different forms of intellectual activity that, the world has changed. People used to think, the notion of intelligence, for example, has got very bundled up with the notion of intellect, like rational, abstract, rational, dispassionate discourse seems to have been kind of promoted to being the kind of first, the primus inter pares, the most important, the most celebrated, the most valuable form of intelligence. And that means that then translates into this hierarchy of subjects that you were talking about. It's almost like the least body, the less bright, the less brightness is required. And there is a huge amount of work now in sociocultural studies, in ethology, and the psychology of work, and so on, to say only if you're looking through that lens, which says abstract rationality is the epitome of intelligence, does being a carpenter or a waiter or a hairdresser or a care worker look less intelligent. If you look through a less refracting lens, these occupations are at least as demanding of intricate thought, the application of experience, the coping with multiple real-time pressures, and so on.
Mm.
And yet we're still left with a curriculum that enshrines and perpetuates this hierarchy. Not that I'm not talking against intellect. I'm talking against putting intellect in its place in a wider conceptualization of what is intelligence. And, the science of intelligence has changed a lot. Bob Sternberg is the most prolific and one of the most admired researchers in the world of intelligence in the US. His latest book is called Adaptive Intelligence, which is all about engaging with climate change. The nature, in an earlier book, he talked about, he said, to me, intelligence is knowing when to think quickly and when to think slowly. Well, that's very different, isn't it? From the classroom where the fast answerers are always supposed to be the brightest children.
Mm.
What about the child who says, when asked a question, that's really interesting and quite complicated. Could I get back to you next week about that? That wouldn't go down well in most classrooms, would it?
Yeah, and I think that that's quite culturally situated as well. My understanding is that in other cultures, I think it's quite a Western thing that the quick-witted, the quick quit, the quick response, we promote that, don't we, in the culture? And the politicians that we see are often very sort of silver-tongued and sort of charismatic and verbally dexterous, and they
Yes.
can use that to mask a lack of reading, being across their brief, for
Yes.
example, and they can devastate somebody in a sort of in a theatrical debate, but it doesn't really help with creating policies that improve people's lives.
It's not so long since the word slow was used as a euphemism for stupid in
Yeah.
school. But what about slow cooking? What about slow thinking? What about taking your time? Einstein is reported to have said, I'm no smarter than anybody else. I just stay with problems longer. Right? So it's like perseverance, resilience was for Einstein a fundamental ingredient of his intelligence, if you like. So, a lot of the work that I've been involved in as a cognitive scientist is about rethinking the notion of intelligence, and that would have enormous knock-ons for the way we think about the way we rethink education, because education has been built on a pretty narrow, pretty scholarly, pretty academic, in some ways monastic sense of what intelligence is,
Mm.
and the science has blown that apart over the last 30 years.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that I would add to your list of the sort of the unquestioned features of school life, the way in which we narrow down subjects, and you know, my son currently is just finished his GCSEs, and he's finding it so difficult to choose just three subjects that he's going to
Hmm.
focus on in great depth for the next 2 years at A level, because he's interested in about 20 things. And one good question would be, why couldn't we have like lots of little nano courses? You could make them
Hmm.
equally rigorous. If
Hmm.
rigor is your thing, you
Yeah.
could make them all nice and rigorous, or a level of rigor to suit different types of
Yes.
kids. But you could be learning about, like you say, about robotics, and you mentioned, you know, stuff that's happening at the moment in the world, in Ukraine and China, and how to fix a toilet,
Yeah.
and just all of these things that we need to know in order
Yeah.
to live a
There are
successful life.
all these kinds of things that, from outside the bubble of education, would seem to have a legitimate claim on a place in the curriculum. From within the bubble of education, people will say, but no, they've got to know the Tudors. They've got to know what a hypotenuse is. They've got to know to say vertical and perpendicular rather than upright and lying down.
Mm.
You know, it's like there is these assumptions that are interesting and urgent to question about what's worth knowing. David Perkins, who's one of the most important role models for me in trying to think deeply about education. One of his most recent books, the subtitle is something about what is it that most young people are likely to need to know? What is life-worthy knowledge rather than scholarly knowledge, rather than the assumption that the best that has been thought and said, which is often the phrase that's Matthew Arnold's phrase, it's often trotted out, somehow or other that necessarily a prima facie provides a better grounding and a better basis for living in the mid 21st century than a whole lot of other things.
Mm.
And that's an assumption, and it's an assumption that we need to question.
Yes. Yeah, and we're sort of talking about curriculum here and saying that we could broaden the curriculum. And there are a few people at the conference who are talking about how we need a more diverse curriculum in a number of different ways. But also, I think that the thing that we both have a big shared interest in is that it's about learning how to learn, right? That at the moment, the way that the school system is configured is that there's all of this top-down pressure. The government sets the curriculum, and Ofsted sort of enforce it, and all of this pressure is placed on the school leaders, and then on down to classroom teachers,
Right.
and on down to kids, and then out to their parents who feel under pressure. And it's just this top-down pressure
Yeah.
at every step along the way, and it's all externally regulated.
Yes.
It's all like that the kid is playing somebody else's game
Yes.
that they haven't signed up to or had any say in, and they're being judged according to how well they can play this game that they're involuntarily playing.
Yes.
And that seems, aside from the ethical question about
Yeah.
that it's just, not giving people a choice, the ability to say no to stuff. That's non-consensual behavior, and I
Sure.
think that there's a big ethical dimension to
Mm.
that. But just in terms of coming back to what you said about what we know about how learning needs to be driven from the outside, and there are so many examples, and Twitter has really revealed this in ways that maybe no other platform has done, of clever, stupid people, people who've done really, really well at playing the school game, and they
Yes.
get straight A stars and a really
Yeah.
good degree from a top university, but they have not got a well-rounded understanding
Absolutely not.
of how to be a good person,
Yes.
or even just how to know what the limits of their knowledge are
Sure.
and when to keep stum. There are so many examples of that, and so it seems like even the so-called winners in the
Yeah.
education game are not really winners in a meaningful sense.
Right. A question that I've often asked in presentations and workshops to teachers is there a difference between being a successful student and a powerful learner? Can you be a successful student and not a very powerful learner? Well, yes, you can be a successful student and a rather narrow learner. You can have learned the tricks and skills of walking a rather narrow plank, but not in terms of being more powerful, more broadly. Can you be a powerful learner and not a very successful student? Yes, if the subjects, if the powerful learning, as in the example of your son you just cited, if your powerful learning is directed by your curiosity towards things that are not designated as part and parcel of the official curriculum. So, we need to be opening up that distinction. I often I find it useful to think about, and this comes from what's going on in the world of child development and cognitive psychology and social psychology of learning and so on, that school is an apprenticeship, and it's an apprenticeship in developing the skills and habits of learning and thinking. And what we have traditionally is an apprenticeship in the skills and habits of being taught. That's what you learn tutelage in school. And some people come out of school with that sense of dependency and compliance. They've developed not powerful, all-round, inquisitive, multifaceted, real-world intelligence, but a kind of passivity in the face of knowledge, let alone the kids who come out of school feeling that they're defeated at learning, that they're, to put it as someone said to me, that her daughter said, she asked her daughter, who was just about to take her A-levels, what are the most important things you learned at school? And one of the things the daughter said was, I think I've learned that I'm crap at learning. Now that's terrible. That's unforgivable. If a perfectly bright, capable young woman is coming out of school feeling, let alone the hundreds of thousands of other people like her who may be less successful in the examination game, that the most important thing they learned at school is that they're not very good at learning. Well, that may be only true in the narrow sense of learning, not in the sense of life-worthy learning. They might be perfectly capable. So that's terrible. So, what a lot of my work is around, what would that apprenticeship look like if we flipped it over and saw school as an apprenticeship, a gradual, a guided development, growth, evolution of the skills and the capacities of curiosity, of determination, of imagination, of critical thinking, of analytical thinking, not just analytical thinking, but critical thinking, creative thinking, social learning, being self-organized, learning to discover your own passions, as Ken Robinson has been passionate about giving us that lesson. Back to the example of your son again. School should be a place where where you learn to be a powerful learner, and you learn what it is you want to be a powerful learner about. What's your particular thing or things? And there should be, I absolutely agree with you, a sense of why not have schools which are built around rigorous, interesting, short tasters of lots of different things, lots of ways of being an economically active, socially responsible, personally lovable human being. It's like there are zillions of ways of giving answers to those questions. And school kind of shrinks the universe down to one very narrow set of answers to those questions, which are not good answers for a very large number of youngsters.
Yes, yeah. And so you said at the start of this conversation that if you want to take, what was it, that you need to have a coherent critique of the current system and also a vision for the future, or else we're just sort of firefighting the current problems rather than working towards some vision of the future.
It's like better test scores, more engagement is often what drives small tinkerings and innovations these days, and I want more than that.
Yes, yes. And so, I mean, I certainly buy into this. The critique that you've offered just now is very persuasive. You can see that it's a I don't know what a dog's breakfast is. I'm searching for the right phrase. We just have this. It's just it's incoherent. It's sort of scattergun. It's been cobbled together over the years in really strange ways, and often we don't even know why we do the things that we do. Why we have 45-minute lessons. Why we have the timetable configured or the school year configured in the way that it is. It just sort of predates our entry into the profession or even our entry onto the planet, and we sort of don't question it. But when we have conversations like this, and as the system becomes more self-aware, I think that we can start to have these deep questions and think it's clearly not working for everybody. There's lots of young people who are really suffering. We haven't really touched on that yet, but there are lots of people who are really suffering because of the way that the system is currently configured and because of that top-down pressure that comes down on everybody. And so let's move now to the vision part. And you've touched upon this a little bit with some of the questions that you've just been asking.
Yeah.
And maybe this will just take the form of a series of questions for now. But what are the kinds of questions, the guiding questions that you think that might lead us towards a clearer vision of a positive future that isn't just firefighting the current problems that we have, but like a vision that we could get behind and work backwards from, you know?
Sure. For me, the most important thing is that we should be having the conversation about vision. We should be having the conversation about purpose, because everything that goes on in a school, those precious 12 years or so, it's like youngsters deserve to be in a place that knows what it's doing, that knows what it's, you know, that young people are lending for a long chunks of their waking life their autonomy to an institution that promises to help them become better prepared to live powerful, interesting, responsible, loving, curious, adventurous lives. I loved the school that I went to a while ago, where their school motto was "Live adventurously." You know, the school mottos are usually kind of just dull, but when I first heard that, I thought, you know, that has some juice in it for me, to live adventurously but not recklessly, to live imaginatively, to live critically, to live communally, to live as a citizen. So all of those things. So you have to start from that, and then all the cogwheels of school should be designed to be driving that outcome. Not that I'm a particular fan of mechanical metaphors, but you know, it should be going like that. So for me, the question of, you know, where we're heading with school has to the first question is what is it that we think, what's our gamble? What's our best guess about what young people need to have when they leave school? All of them, that will equip them, that they will feel grateful for. They may not feel grateful at the moment. There's that, you know, I wish my mum had made me learn the piano argument. It's like, you know, it's not, they may not feel grateful for it at the moment, but, you know, when they're at university in their second year, when they're in their first job, when they have their first child, everybody should be able to look back to their schooling and think, I'm grateful for that. And that's a mixture of knowledge and forms of expertise, literacies, and characteristics or habits of mind or learning dispositions or whatever you like to call them, a kind of orientation towards learning. When I'm being professorial, I call it epistemic character. Though a sense of confidence, capability, and appetite for engaging with things that are challenging and worthwhile in life. For me, that's a kind of trunk of character. I remember having an argument once with someone who said, you want everybody to come out of school the same, you know, all resilient, all resourceful, all reflective, all what have you. You know, that like you just want a world of little character clones, and I can't imagine anything worse than that. And I agree, I can't imagine anything worse than that. But I think you can make a good argument that there is a trunk to the tree of character, which everybody pretty much would benefit from being resilient when you need to be, from being critical of what you hear and learn, being able to detect fake news, or what you mentioned, the Postman and Weingartner book, Teaching as a Subversive Activity, in which they quote Hemingway as saying everybody needs to have a built-in shock-proof crap detector. And boy, do we need that. Do we all need that today?
Yeah.
And it's perfectly possible to provide that, to be sociable and so on. So I think that the job of school, the core purpose of school, aside from the child minding and the handing on of the treasury of the past, that core trunk, which we should not lose sight of, is the building of that epistemic character. When you have that, then you can blossom in a myriad of different ways. You don't become a clone. But I do think there is a strong argument for building that core. And that's what the Learning Power approach has been trying to identify, lots of other people, not just myself, trying to identify what that trunk of character might look like, and then how can we build a curriculum? What kinds of activities, what sorts of challenges, what kinds of interactions, what forms of conversation lead towards those ends? Act like good exercise machines, if you like. You think of the notion of the mind gym. good exercise machines for implicitly, you don't have to talk about them a lot, implicitly but effectively building those qualities of character. And then we can start thinking about what would be, we can have a conversation that doesn't start from, yes, but but everybody needs to know about the Tudors, to, is this a good exercise machine for building those characteristics? So, and that, that might be the next, maybe the last bit of our conversation.
Okay, thank you. And so you're starting with a really clear sense of purpose, and for you, it's about building this epistemic character, this core trunk of traits that allow you to explore the world in an even-handed way. I want to come back to something that's more of like a structural change that we could entertain. You said earlier something really interesting, which is about the idea, like, why do we have terminal exams at the end of school? What if exams? What if that assessment was placed onto universities and employers? And for some people, even just entertaining that for a moment, it's sort of a shocking thought,
isn't it?
Because it's so. You might just think, well, what would be the point of a school that didn't have terminal exams? But let's just sit with that for a moment.
Yeah,
let's just entertain it.
It's worth exploring, isn't it?
In a what if way. What might that look like? What would the implications of that be if we got rid of GCSEs and A levels, and we put the onus on assessment onto other
right. I think of it as like not at exit points but at entry points. So I think that, I mean, sadly the Cambridge Pre-U exam is no longer, I don't think, but I don't think it would be that difficult for universities to design an entrance test to see whether people have the equipment to be able to benefit from the expensive commodity that they're offering, the expensive forms of knowledge development which they're offering. I don't think that will be too hard. I don't think it will be too difficult for an employer within half an hour or an hour to be able to find out in a group of people who can read a short article intelligently, who can pick out the main points, and who can write a working summary.
Well, employers
of them.
are increasingly doing that, aren't they? There's lots of them are taking, like, going qualification blind. They're not even looking at the CV. They're doing their own assessments.
Absolutely.
So you can see that.
Yeah, very much so, because they find that A-level results or even university degree, class of degree, don't predict, I mean, particularly in the creative industries, are not reliable predictors of the kind of fluid intelligence that they want their people to have.
So I suppose a counterpoint to this might be that people would say, so essentially the entry point, the entry exams, the pre-U or whatever it was equivalent for universities or for employers would de facto become the end point, and people would be under pressure. And I think that an argument that lots of people take really seriously is that it wouldn't be immune to being gamed by privileged families who could pay for tutors, who could prepare their kids for that, and if schools weren't involved in that effort as well, that it would create a more unequal world, for example.
Yes. But the status quo, I mean, we have to start from the recognition, and I think this is pretty universal. Look at the rethinking assessment movement at the moment, that the status quo is not neutral. The status quo is not basically benign. We have to remember for what the teaching unions refer to as the forgotten third, that the examination game at the moment requires collateral damage. It is norm referenced. Every year they shift the normal distribution curve to make sure that you get the right number, the right percentage of A's, and that requires the right percentage of fails or E's or D's or whatever, ones and twos and threes and fours. So the situation is not benign at the moment. Therefore, we need to be looking at other forms of assessment, styles of assessment, even though they may also have their glitches and their drawbacks. They're not knockdown arguments against exploring smarter ways of implementing different kinds of assessment. Yet people often say, well, obviously somebody could game them. They're gaming the system at the moment. You know, schools are gaming the system by off-rolling youngsters who are going to make their results look bad. You know, it is not. It's part of what, I forget what that economic law is called. That when you take an how does it go? It's like when you make a feature of a performance a goal of the performance, then the functioning of the system is perverted. So when you make number of people visiting your museum your target, the clicking of the turnstile, don't be surprised when museum directors start counting people delivering parcels from Amazon as if they were visitors to the museum, because they add extra clicks to the turnstile. And head teachers can't really be blamed if they find other ways of helping to boost their exam results, on which their own careers might be entirely dependent in these punitive days.
Yes.
Don't be surprised of that. It's like politicians need to understand a little more about human nature before they start coming in heavy-footed with some of the proposals that there are around at the moment.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And so I can see, I've had the advantage of having already seen the list of questions that you have. I think we've maybe just got time for one more.
Sure.
And if I may, I'd like to pick this idea of teachers as research supervisors.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting idea. Can you expand on that?
Well, it's more like, the much maligned inquiry learning. It's creating space. It's like, I've talked before about this idea of the apprenticeship, of developing. The whole point behind inquiry learning, research projects, project-based learning, problem-based learning, is not that it's some kind of dramatic, discontinuous style of education from more didactic education. It's that we are growing students' capacity to be more self-regulated and more independent in deciding, choosing, managing, organizing, troubleshooting, and evaluating learning for themselves. You don't develop that capacity by constantly being told how good you are, by being constantly told what to learn.
Mm-hmm.
So we needed like a developmental model of education, which astonishingly is missing. It's like, what's it all adding up to?
Mm-hmm.
What's it heading towards? So teachers as research supervisors is another way you could put it, is teachers as mind coaches. Teachers as designers of activity, just like a sports coach, that are constantly just at the leading edge or just beyond what their students are currently able of handling responsibly and maturely for themselves. If they can't yet, then our job is to build their capacity to do so, not to throw them into the deep end as people who talk about unguided discovery learning. Like they keep slipping in this kind of unguided discovery learning. Why does it have to be unguided? It is guided, but you gradually take the training wheels off. Like, as you learn to ride your first two-wheeler bike. So teachers as research, what was the phrase I used? Research supervisors, is a way of saying foregrounding, part of their job is to create youngsters who need less supervision, who are building their capacity to be their own researchers, just as people are when they're doing their doctoral studies. When I was doing my doctoral studies, or you were doing yours, you were serving an apprenticeship in building your capacity to be an independent thinker, learner, self-organizer.
Yeah.
Why not start that when they're 5?
Yeah, and I mean the common argument against that you hear is that they don't have the background knowledge that enables the sort of the creative. Hold your thoughts for a second, just for the benefits of the audience. That you need to know stuff in order to be able to think critically and analytically and so on. And there's a dollop of truth in that. But for me, I don't. I'm sort of begging the question by answering. I think that that it doesn't have to be taught. That knowledge, of course, has to come from somewhere, but it doesn't have to be taught.
And there's knowledge.
There's an assumption that in order to become knowledgeable enough to be able to engage in a meaningful research project that isn't just laden with misconceptions, that you have to be taught a whole bunch of curriculum knowledge in art and literature and history and science
before
and
you can start thinking about it.
Yes.
I call this the pile of bricks on your lawn theory. It's like, you can't start thinking about designing the extension to your house until you've had 5 loads of bricks dumped on your front lawn. And then suddenly, by magic, the design of your extension or your conservatory or something will magically appear. If you've got enough bricks dumped on your lawn, it will magically appear. Well, it doesn't. It doesn't in young minds any more than it does in architecture or house building. It's like it's a continual spiral. It's a didactic. It's like this knowledge. It's like the way children come to question Father Christmas. It's like, they don't have to become experts in Christmasology. They don't have to spend years thinking about it before they begin to become critical consumers, to realize that there might be some flaws in the argument that they've been sold about this fat man sliding down their non-existent chimney. It's like wherever they are, we can begin to add a critical and creative aspect to the way they consume that knowledge. It's just nuts to say the world is divided into 2 kinds of people called novices and experts, and novices are not like experts, so that you can't ask them to do the kinds of things that experts do. That's complete novice. They're completely wrong. The question is, how did the experts get to be experts? Like through what processes, through what mistakes, through what tutoring, through what coaching? That's the question we should be asking, not this kind of bonkers idea that children are novices for umpteen years until suddenly they become experts and can start thinking. It's just, that's not a thoughtful argument.
Yeah, but it is a widely held one. It's a widely held belief, and it's the thing that's really holding the show on the road at the moment. I think this belief in the knowledge-rich curriculum, that this is the best endowment that we can give young people to give them the best chance of becoming those critical, creative people. And we need to have that question, but also, we need to have that argument. But also, this is not an all or nothing thing. And so I don't think that we would argue, or I don't know, let's leave this. You might say, well, let's keep, for example, I often say, Derry Hannum often says that we should have 20% of time in the school day given over to self-directed learning.
Yeah.
And I would argue, on top of that, another 20% given over to interdisciplinary learning or cross-disciplinary learning or more real-world learning, if you like, learning about the world that, as you say, on the news, they don't say, and in geography news, there's been an earthquake, and in history news, it's like there's this horrendous humanitarian crisis happening.
Right.
And, there's all kinds of dimensions to that. It's political, economic. People weren't given the resources or the skill set to be able to build earthquake-proof houses.
And our brains are designed to weave these things together.
Yeah.
There aren't silos in the brain.
So my question is, as a parting question, is it a cop-out to say that we should keep, for example, 60% of what we have currently and just have 20% of this bolted-on self-directed stuff and interdisciplinary learning? Is that a cop-out? Is that keeping the show on the road? Is that keeping this architecture of, what do you call it, the archaeology of education, an institution built on sand on these shaky foundations? Is that just sort of propping up this idea that's fundamentally falling apart? Do we need to reconfigure it more thoroughly than that, do you think?
I think we need to reconfigure it in the developmental dimension, which I talked about a little while ago. I don't think you can say 20%, 40%, 60%. I think you can say that what we should be doing from age 5 or previously is systematically, consciously, deliberately designing the complexity of the knowledge and the demandingness, the degree of challenge of the activities that you're asking children to engage that knowledge through. We should be gradually escalating the complexity and the level of challenge of those things as they go up through school. At the moment, interestingly, you go into early years settings And the whole ethos is around getting children to think about what they want to do today and how to get resources for themselves, in the vast majority of them. They are being coached the minute they arrive in becoming more independent, more resourceful, more self-reliant, more discerning about what they're doing. And by the time they get to year 6, where's all that gone? It's as if the pyramid is sort of balancing on its pyramid. It's going in exactly the wrong direction. We start off right, but we should end up with sixth form or university teaching being like supercharged versions of what's going on in early years, what's going on in Key Stage 1 at the moment. And I don't think it's helpful to try and come up with some simplistic formula, like, much as I love Derry Hannum, but like 20% of this, because it depends on what you're doing in that 20%. But certainly, I think we should be moving in the direction of skilling youngsters up and giving them the confidence to be able to engage individually and collectively, which is equally important, with challenges that are increasingly complex and important to themselves, to their communities, very importantly. I've begun to sketch out in my own head a curriculum. In fact, I think Bill Lucas and I wrote a little bit about this in Educating Ruby, earlier book of ours, about what the curriculum would look like if it was built on this sense of escalating research, skill, and confidence. And I think that would be, for me, a driving question about how we rethink school. Or perhaps we need to be a little bolder and say reimagine school. Because if we don't reimagine what we want it to be, as we've said before, James, you just end up with a little bit of kind of nudging here and pushing there, and something that doesn't have the impetus, doesn't have the momentum of we're getting there. The best schools do. The schools with the most adventurous and thoughtful principles are on that journey, that culture change, culture shift journey. But not all, and not nearly enough of them. And we need to see, just as we want young people to be on a developmental journey, so every school principal, every senior leadership team needs to see itself as being on a journey towards an ever more rich fulfillment of a clear vision of what we want youngsters to be like when they leave us.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with me and with our conference audience today. Thought-provoking as always.
Real pleasure, James. Thank you. You're a great co-thinker and provoker. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
To see more videos like this one, visit rethinking-ed.org/reconf22. That's RECONF22. To connect with our conference speakers and delegates, you can join the Rethinking Ed Mighty Network for free at rethinking-education.mn.co. And finally, if you enjoyed this video, please consider donating to the Rethinking Ed conference. All proceeds will go to educational charities. Visit buymeacoffee.com/reconf22. That's RECONF22.